My name is Alejandra Muñoz. I'm the Government Affairs Manager at CETF, and I'll be your moderator and tour guide for the next hour and a half. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see so many people online. As mentioned, today's webinar, Bridging the Planning Gap, will seek to respond to the question, are Europe's NECPs fit for achieving the 2030 climate and energy targets? We have an exciting program lined up featuring stakeholders from key institutions, from the European Commission, European Court of Auditors, as well as CATF and EMBER. But before we go straight into the topic, some very quick housekeeping rules and agenda. So please note that this webinar is currently being recorded, and the recording will be also shared after this event. We have allocated an hour and a half to our speakers today, who will be divided in two different panels, as you can see from your screen. The first half of our webinar will be mainly focused to understand the question, is Europe on track? And we'll explore also lessons learned from the previous NECP cycle. And the second half of the webinar will bring a complementary analysis from EMBER and CATF, and also concrete recommendations on how to improve the plans before the deadline in June. We will also be presenting CATF's NECP playbooks, which we launched today on a number of thematic topics, including carbon capture and storage, methane mitigation, hydrogen, small modular reactors, as well as super hot rock energy. So also note that we'll have two dedicated Q&A sessions after each of the two panels. Please don't hesitate to ask any questions as we go along, and keep checking our chat for any resources we'll be putting into there. Wonderful. So with that, I'd like to kick off the event by introducing today's topic, the national energy and climate plans, as well as the role in bridging the planning gap. So as you know, reaching net zero in 2050 will require strategic and comprehensive planning. Getting there would require the European Union to start planning today and move towards an energy system that is radically different than from the one we have today. One that it's completely decarbonized, one that it's fully independent, and one that enables industrial and economic growth and competitiveness. Fortunately, though, we have already a planning framework in place that can help with this. Passed in 2018, the governance regulation requested countries, European member states, to develop integrated NECPs. These NECPs had to detail how countries were planning to achieve 2030 targets. They were also requested to submit what they called a long-term strategy to 2050, and for both of these plans to be consistent with each other. Now, a lot has changed since the first round of NECPs, and now the European Commission is asking countries to update their plans with the transformed geopolitical reality and also the increased bloc-wide climate ambition targets, raising from the Fit for 55, among others. Now, while the goals are clearly articulated and legally binding, the path to get there might not be as clear. This is an issue at the heart of what CATF calls the planning gap, which left unaddressed might jeopardize climate action altogether. Now, there's still a small window of opportunity of change. The ongoing NECP update still give us the opportunity to close the gap and connect the dots between the Europe of today and the Europe of tomorrow. Most countries have submitted their plans already, and only 4 months remain until the final deadline. All of this to say that it's not too late, and today we'll jointly discover how we can solve the planning gap. Super. So now that we have all the background and surrounding the process and the update, I'll be handing over to our next speaker, Mrs. Lee Beck. Lee is CATF Senior Director for Europe and Middle East, leading CATF's climate strategy to advance a broad range of climate solutions. In both regions, she's also responsible for advancing CATF efforts on the global climate policy stage through CATF's presence at COP. Lee, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours for the next 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandra, and thank you all for joining us here today. I'm just really, really excited to be able to welcome you to this event, which we really hope can serve as a pivotal check-in moment to reflect together with experts and you in the audience on the content of Europe's main planning tool, the National Energy and Climate Plans. I also just want to thank my colleagues from the events team and at Clean Air Task Force for making this webinar happening. And then, of course, congratulate my colleagues, particularly Nicole Pavia and Alejandra Munoz, for launching the NECP playbooks today, which I think really are an incredible tool for governments to understand how they can incorporate and plan for advanced energy tech for decarbonization and methane mitigation. And so in my really short keynote, I just really want to set up the stellar panels that we have planned for today and reflect on the importance of implementing legislation and planning for climate infrastructure realization. I think it is becoming increasingly clear the sooner we can understand the footprint, size, and kind of the infrastructure we need to achieve climate neutrality in Europe, the more efficient from a cost and land use perspective the undertaking will be. And as all of you well know, I think in the last 4 years, the EU has really undertaken an unprecedented legislative marathon, attempting to regulate for its climate ambition. Fit for 55 package, Net Zero Industry Act now largely in place. I think we really need to make substantial steps towards implementation. Climate policy and climate action isn't one and done. What we really need to think through is how does the reality look on the ground? How do we get steel in the ground in the member states? And then also take that feedback back into the next round of climate legislation. And I think what we're really excited to see in the most recent 2040 targets communication from the Commission is this acknowledgement that we need to deliver steel in the ground and we need to plan for it. And as Alejandra has already said, and I think we're going to hear more about this, the onus is, of course, on the member states now. The NECP revisions obviously offer a huge opportunity to translate aspirations into steel and ground reality. And we're really looking at CATF, we're really looking for governments to not just look at these NECPs as a kind of box-ticking exercise, but really use them as an impetus to think long and hard about the measures and investments and infrastructure needed to decarbonize on time. And so just 3 points on this. I think number one, we really want to see government think through, take into account all the tools that they have in the toolbox from a technology perspective and tailor the suite of technologies that they'll choose to decarbonize to their economic and geographical realities. Number two, and, just reiterating what Alejandra said, there is the planning gap. We need to think about the technologies and approaches that we need beyond 2030 today to achieve climate neutrality. Most of the additional emissions reductions will require technologies and markets and policies that are not yet in place. So we really need to think about the right incentives, the right financial support, and the legal certainty to redirect public and private finance to where it is most needed to lay the pathway and give us additional time. I will just say the average carbon capture and storage facility takes 4 to 5 years to plan and execute to get to a testing. So it gives you, if we just have 2 decades, it gives you a good understanding why really the clock is ticking, which is my third point. For climate neutrality to become a reality in less than 2 decades, we really need to take decisions today. And they will remain out of reach unless we rethink planning, which we define as the myriad of processes and decisions that culminate in determining what infrastructure will be constructed, by whom, when, and where. So just to say and close out, proactive planning is really, really pressing, given that the symptoms of inadequate planning, such as long interconnection queues, mismatch of realities on the ground and bureaucracy to process, slowing renewable energy deployment rates, supply chain issues really have our seriously stifling the transition and our ability to deliver on climate ambition. So there is still an impressive array of policies to enact, and there's still a long way to go. But I think we're very much looking forward to this conversation today, and to reflect together with member states, with stakeholders, with industry on how we can elevate planning to really ensure that we're having a successful journey towards the climate neutral future and really thinking through climate as an infrastructure problem. So with this, I'm honored to be here. Thank you all for joining us. And I am going to hand it back to you, Alejandra.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lee, for putting, again, the focus on the importance of planning. We will now go straight into our first panel discussion, where we'll try to understand whether the current plans are fit for purpose and put Europe really collectively on track. Joining us today here, we have Paolo. He's from Paolo Cassini, who works as a policy officer and economic analyst at the European Commission, DG Klima. He co-leads the assessment of the updated national energy and climate plans, and he's responsible for the implementation of measures in support of industry decarbonization. He joined the Commission in 2013, and he holds a PhD in economics from the University Libre de Bruxelles. Welcome, Paolo. Thank you so much for joining us. Also, in his panel, we have Lorenzo Pirelli, who's a senior auditor at the European Court of Auditors and head of task of the special report EU Climate and Energy Target, which he will be presenting very shortly. Lorenzo joined the ECA in 2010 and carried out several performance audits. He has also a background in European research and innovation policies, thanks to his PhD from the University of Milan. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. We will start with Paolo, who will now present the main takeaways from the European Commission assessment, which was presented in December 2023. Paolo, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
It's been a huge exercise with a lot of people involved, and we try to involve different experts from different policy fields. So today I will try just to highlight the most important elements, or some of the most important elements, so that you get a little bit of a glimpse of what we did. And I also try to help you interpret the results of our assessment. Next slide, please. So what we did is so we received the plans in a little bit late compared to the official deadlines. So we had to adjust a little bit the timing of the assessment accordingly. In practice, what we did, we published in 2 batches an assessment that consisted of dedicated staff working documents for each member state. So basically a more detailed assessment for each member state's NECP. This was accompanied by a set of recommendations, which were rather overarching and included several dimensions. And then we also had kind of a EU-wide assessment in which we try to gather all the information from the different NECPs, aggregate it at the EU level, and use this aggregated information to assess how far we are from the EU targets. Long story short, and like a little bit of anticipation of the main result, is that indeed there are several gaps, and I'll try to show you which gaps we identified, and again how we should interpret these gaps at this stage. Next slide, please. I think I will spend a little bit more time on this particular slide, not because, well, also because I'm in DG Klima, so I'm more familiar with this data. But also because I think it's an instructive point on how we should look at these intermediate results of the assessment. So this is basically our assessment of how member states are faring, and so how the EU is faring compared to the headline targets of reducing the total greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to 1990. And if you look at the results of this assessment, the result in short is that we identify the gap. This gap is relatively significant because we are 4 percentage points shorter of the 55% target. So this is definitely not good news. However, I think there are a couple of caveats to take into account when we interpret this data. The first is that, of course, well, these are draft NECPs. That means that member states are still working on improving the planning. And this is very important for several reasons. First of all, because, well, as you know, the Fit for 55 package has been, in a way, completed with the most recent measures very recently. And that meant that member states had very little time to, let's say, incorporate these new measures into their national planning. So in a way, this is not so surprising. This is all the more important because, of course, in the last years, I'd say these last years have been very eventful. There have been many things going on, including the crisis in the Ukraine and the situation that created on the energy markets. So to a certain extent, it's a very complicated period also for member states, and getting to the target and planning in advance has not been the easiest, to put it mildly. So if you take that into account, you already have a little bit of a different picture when you interpret this chart here. Another element that is a little bit reassuring for us is that this blue line that I depicted here is in a way a little bit of a conservative scenario. In practice, the member states had to submit different scenarios for now up to 2030 and possibly farther on to 2050. One of the scenarios is the one which we call with an existing measure, or in short, WEM scenario, and which is a kind of a baseline. It's a benchmark scenario. And then they should submit also the scenario with additional measures, what we call the WAM scenario. And this scenario should include also the new policies. So that it's, in a way, the most ambitious scenario that is the real scenario member states are working on. And now, as it happens, some member states did not have the time to complete this WAM scenario. So there's a more ambitious scenario, and only submitted this baseline scenario. And so we know as a fact that some member states have more ambitious scenarios that will be submitted in the coming months. So this 4 percentage point of gap is, in a way, a very conservative estimate. We are relatively confident that the gap will be a couple of percentage points more than that. Of course, let's see what happens in the next months, but hopefully this is the case. Of course, this doesn't mean that we should relax and just let things happen. There are reasons for concern. So indeed, we identified several challenges, including the fossil fuel use for energy generation, which is still in some countries not prevalent, but still not phased out completely. They use fossil fuel subsidies, the lack of proper effort in terms of adaptation. Next slide, please. Here I go a little bit into the sectoral specificity and, for instance, for what concerns the effort sharing regulation. So basically all the sectors that are not included in the ETS directive. We also see a little bit of a gap. So we decrease only by 34 percentage point. This is the expectation of the decrease, which means that we expect a little bit a gap around 6 percentage points, which is of course a reason for concern. However, also in this case, a couple of caveats here. We have to take into account that member states have some flexibilities that they can use. So the fact that one member state has a gap does not necessarily mean that he is in breach of the effort sharing regulation. For what concerns LULUCF, again, there is a gap, which is not enormous, but is still very significant. Next slide, please. For what concerns decarbonization, here as well, we see that basically only 7 member states submitted a contribution which is in line with what is expected. And that resulted in a gap, which is not huge again, but we reached more at the best case scenario, 39.3 share of renewable against a target of 42.5. So much more work is needed. Next slide, please. Again, for energy efficiency, if you look at here, we have basically 2 targets to take into account, one on the final energy consumption and the other one on the primary energy consumption. And here we see that basically only 4 member states submitted contributions that would fulfill both targets. And so compared to the binding target, we are short of 11.7%. Next slide, please. We, of course, also looked into more qualitative targets. So, for instance, in terms of energy security, which is, for obvious reason, extremely important given the geopolitical circumstances. We analyzed the fact that they use so that the supply of gas is still too much concentrated on few sources, and so that much more diversification is needed. On the electricity side, we spotted that basically member states has focused a lot on the generation side, but very little on reducing the demand for electricity and improving storage. Similarly, on oil, in terms of planning for the gradual decline of the use of oil, member states are a bit of lacking precision. That is why basically all member states have received recommendation so far. Next slide, please. Here on this slide, I will be very short. We also analyze, of course, the internal energy markets and how basically member states took into account the flexibility of the energy system, the interconnections, but also how they took into account, say, the consumer side. So how to measure energy poverty, which is super important in terms of acceptability of the climate action, and also consumer empowerment in terms, for instance, of access to energy communities. Next slide, please. This is something, in terms of financing and investment, we had also, we're a bit disappointed in terms of what member states delivered us. On the one hand, we realized that, so we asked a lot. We tried to be very demanding with member states. We asked them to provide not only an estimate of the total investment needs, but also to say identify the different funding sources for this investment, identifying at the very least the split between the public sources and the private sources, but also ideally trying to assess and to estimate the cost of the different policies and the different measures that the member states are planning to invest. And that meant also in practice disaggregating the investment needs at least by sector or by technology. And we asked them also then, as a consequence, to estimate the gap between the investment needs and the available sources. And in practice, unfortunately, very few member states managed to do that. Again, we do recognize that the exercise is extremely difficult, but indeed, much more work is needed in this direction. Next slide, please. Lastly, we looked at basically some horizontal topics on which I will have to be very short today, unfortunately. That doesn't mean they are less important than the others, but just for the sake of time, we looked into the just transition. So basically how member states take into account the socioeconomic impact of the climate and energy transition. And here we identified several gaps to be filled in the analysis. We looked at regional cooperation for cross-border projects. And lastly, on how member states made sure that the public participation was not only possible, but also duly taken into account in the planning. Next slide, please. Now we're at the stage in which we are, well, unfortunately, still waiting for 2 member states to submit their draft plan. We are assessing the final plan that we received just a couple of weeks ago. In the meantime, we're trying to support member states that did submit in time their NECP and that did receive their recommendations already. We're trying to help them in implementing the recommendation by engaging in bilateral discussion at the technical level and trying to understand which elements are more complicated for them to implement. Needless to say, these next months will be crucial for them to implement these recommendations and deliver a final plan. And we do believe that doing it will be very important in terms of making sure that the whole governance regulation and in particular the NEC process does not lose the credibility it had built in the past. Of course, we stand ready to support member states in the exercise, and we hope that member states will deliver in time. That's it. I'm of course available for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paolo, for your presentation, and apologies to our audience for the little technical issues that we had. If it's okay with the other panelists, our colleague Nicole Pavia will manage the slides on our end to avoid any technical problems. Wonderful. So now moving on, and we've seen that there's a clear need for extra efforts. We'll move to our next presentation. Lorenzo, you're one of the lead authors of the ECHA special report. And we're very interested to see the conclusions and also the recommendations from your audit and how this can be translated into the current NECP process. So yeah, I'll just encourage the audience as we go along to continue using the Q&A box and raise any questions. Thank you very much. Lorenzo, please go ahead.
Thanks for the floor and good afternoon to everybody. So I come from the European Court of Auditors, which is the smallest institution, but we are checking the other institutions. So we are checking basically the Commission and the member state, how they implement the EU budget and the EU policies. So this report is about the EU climate and energy targets. And as you see from the title, the main message is that we achieved the 2020 target as Europe, but we found little signals, little indications that the actions are so far sufficient to reach the 2030 targets. So moving to the next slide, you will see that as most of you may know, the EU set itself 3 headline targets for 2020 and 2030. The most famous and ultimate target is the reducement of the greenhouse gas emissions, which is being updated over time, and the current target is -55 for 2030. Then the second target, in the next slide, is the increase of the share of renewable energy, which is also a moving target. It was 20% in 2020 and is moving up to 45% by 2030. And then in the next slide, you see the third target, which is the one about promoting energy efficiency, which means reducing energy consumption, which was a reduction of 20% compared to a reference scenario by 2020. And also this target is becoming more and more challenging for the future, for 2030. Okay, against this context, in the next slide, you see that the EU budget that we are checking is something in the order of 87 billion per year in the current multi-financial framework. Just to give an idea of the size, this is around a bit less than 10% of the total investment needed to reach the 2030 targets, according to several studies, which estimated in the order of 1 trillion per year. So in the next slide, you will see that what we checked in our audit last year was whether the EU has built its approach on a successful action to reach the 2030 target. So we checked basically three things. First, whether the EU achieved its 2020 target thanks to its own climate action, or a little bit by chance or by thanks to other factors. Secondly, whether the EU compares well to the rest of the world. And thirdly, whether member state and commission are drawing lessons for improving the progress towards the 2030 target. So we focus on the commission and with a special focus on 5 member states, which altogether represent almost half of the EU greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so let's move to the results of our audit. So what we found. So again, the first question, the main thing we found is that it's true that for 2020, the EU reached all the 3 headline targets. So it's a positive message. However, there were at least 2 big factors that were not really considered enough when assessing this success. It was the 2009 financial crisis and the 2020 COVID pandemic. Our point is that without these negative events, which have inevitably reduced GDP, energy consumption, and so on, compared to the more optimistic scenario on when these targets were set in around 2007, the situation will be less positive. So what we suggest is that we should, to have a more balanced perspective, one should take into account also intensity indicators. Intensity indicators are indicators in which you assess the results, so the emissions, for example, per unit of GDP or per capita, so against a variable which gives a feeling of how the situation has evolved over time. And it's interesting to see that there is a difference between absolute emissions. So take the case of Greece, for example, the first country in the list. It's true that emissions have reduced by 45% up to 2020. But if you look a bit more into the drivers of this change, you see that in reality, the emission per unit of GDP, so the intensity indicator, has not progressed so equally well. It's a bit the same story for Italy. While on the opposite, if you look at Denmark or Sweden, you can see that maybe emissions did not decrease so much. For example, Sweden, the last row, they decreased only by 31%, but in relative terms, so compared to the GDP progress, and Sweden was continuing growing well up to 2020, the emissions per unit of GDP reduced by 46%. So what we suggest is to look also in intensity terms. So moving to the next slide, you see that generally speaking, we find that there is a bit of lack of transparency on how member states reached their target. And our point is specifically about the issue of flexibilities, which in simple terms are a mechanism which is foreseen by the regulation, by which basically member states who did not achieve their own target, they can buy emissions or renewable energy shares from other countries who overreached. their targets. And you see, for example, in this graph, so that take Slovenia as the first country, the member state achievement was like 24%, and to achieve their target of 25%, they bought around 1% of renewable energy shares, so from statistical data from other member states. The only country which did not comply even legally, as far as we know, with the regulation was France, which did not buy the missing shares from other countries. So simply didn't reach the target, neither with its own action nor legally complying with it. So moving to the next slide, we are on the second part of our audit, which was about the comparing the EU with the rest of the world. So generally speaking, the EU is doing quite well in the sense that global emission increased by 57%, mainly because of China and India, big increase of emissions, which means that in relative terms, the EU share of global emission dropped from 15% to less than 8% in the same period. So the EU performed well and even better than other developed countries in the world, like the US, for example, or Japan. So moving to the next slide, you will see that although this is a relatively positive message for Europe, one should put it in a context to have the complete picture. And the thing we noticed is that the way in Europe we calculate emissions basically exclude emissions which are caused as a result of trade. So they are caused by the so-called carbon leakage. So the fact that we are importing goods which are manufactured somewhere else, for example, washing machines from China. So if you take into account this carbon leakage phenomenon, there are studies made also by the Commission which say that emissions would be, EU emissions would be around 8% higher. And then another type of emission which is not accounted, reported in EU emissions is emission from international aviation and shipping. So a flight Paris to New York is not considered in the European emissions. In this slide, you also see on the right the sectoral contribution. So you see that generally speaking, the sectors covered by the ETS, the European Trading System, like energy supply and industry, have well contributed to the reduction, while sectors which like transport and buildings, they are lagging behind. So moving to the next slide, the message is that the Commission knows well which sector successfully contributed to the target. So as I said before, this sectors like energy supply and industry did their part, while sector related to transport and in particular aviation did not contribute, or on the contrary, contribute negatively to the reduction of emissions. Okay, so moving to the last observations, the Commission and Member State know little about the cost and the effects of the actions put in place to reach the 2020 targets. So the problem is that in several audits, we found that even for EU funding, so funding which is managed by the Commission and the Member State, there is generally no information on how much these spending programs funded by the EU have contributed to the EU climate targets. For national funding, there is a database run by the Commission via the Environmental Agency with a list of policies, more than 2,000 policies and measures. However, the main problem is that there are almost no data on cost and effects on emission reductions. So in practice, this database is still of little use for the moment. And for private funding, again, there is basically no data, although many documents say that most of the funding should come from private sources. So national energy climate plans are a powerful tool to inform decisions for the current decade about investment gaps, source of funding, and main policies. However, as the Commission colleagues already said, most of the information provided by member state was incomplete or inconsistent or not useful to shed the light on how much money is needed, where do we get the money from, and how to fill these gaps. So we acknowledge that the Commission provided good guidance to the member states for the update of the NCPs. However, basically this guidance remains voluntary for the member state to be applied. So to conclude, in the next slide, you see that the main messages of our report is that first, we reach as Europe the 2020 target, but not only to its own climate action. Secondly, as EU, we compare well internationally, but not all emissions. So remember, carbon leakage and aviation and shipping are accounted for. And third point is that the Commission, yes, has a good overview of which sectors best contribute to the target, however, lacks key information on the costs and effects of specific policies to reach the targets. So the main message is that now 2030 targets, as we well know, are more ambitious than the 2020 ones. So we found so far little indications that this ambition will translate into sufficient action. So let's move to the recommendations. So what we recommend is basically to improve the reporting in a way to better assess the drivers of the member state progress. So better look at intensity indicators, for example, with the aim to distinguish the impact of the policies put in place from the impact of external factors like GDP cycle, COVID, or variables which are sort of external to the policies put in place. Also to provide more transparency, for example, on the price at which member states sell or buy greenhouse gas emissions data and renewable energy share data. Then in the next slide, the second recommendation is to account for all greenhouse gas emission caused by the EU. So if, as we state in several documents, as the Commission says, Europe wants to be a global leader about climate change, we should report on all emissions as European we cause in the world, so including emissions that we cause by importing goods from the rest of the world. And that's why we also say that we should assess the feasibility of including in the 2050 target the share that the EU is causing or in emissions from international aviation and shipping. So the flight Paris to New York, for example. Then third recommendation, we suggest, we recommend the Commission to better support member states in their commitment to achieve the 2030 target. This means, in practice, working together with member states to include in these updated national energy climate plans consistent information on on the cost and the effects of the policies, and on investment needs and funding sources to clarify how these needs could be filled, with the aim to achieve more transparency towards the path needed to reach the targets. And finally, to consider the option of closer aligning the price of these transfers with market price. So flexibility can make sense to allow member states to be more efficient in reaching their targets, but the process should be more transparent to be sure that member states who are lagging behind and are not making their own contribution, if they have to buy emission from other countries, they are buying them at a fair price, which reflects the cost of these emissions. Thank you, and I look forward for your questions and discussions.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for your presentation. We're now going to transition quickly to the Q&A because we're running a little bit late. So I'll be very thankful if you can limit your answers to just 30 to 40 seconds. Apologies, but we're running a bit late. So we have a Q&A already in the box. I believe this will be more targeted to Paolo. Paolo, we hear here, what will the Commission do if, on the basis of the final updated NECPs, there is an ambition gap towards the 2030 union binding targets as regard to renewable energies or energy efficiency they include as an example? Yes, if you can quickly answer. Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks. So, well, first of all, we hope it won't happen, but should it happen, basically the governance regulation requires that the Commission proposes measures to, for member states to bridge this gap. Now, of course, given the political cycle that is going to an end and the elections coming up, there is more than a chance that whatever measures will be necessary will be decided by the next Commission. So at this stage, it's really premature to say what exactly will be done because there is there's no way to know it now. The short answer is that the governance regulation requires that the Commission takes measures to fill this gap. In the meantime, of course, we're trying to cooperate with member states to make sure that this will not happen. But let's see.
Thank you so much, Paolo. Wonderful. I also see that Sebastian has his hand raised. I don't know if you'd like to intervene directly. Okay. It's been clarified. Wonderful. So moving on, and I'll ask also a question to Lorenzo. You mentioned in your last slides in the observations that there was a lack of transparency, and I'm not sure our audience knows what this would mean. If you could give us some examples and also let us know if this was intentional or is it something similar to greenwashing? What did you mean exactly? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for your question. Actually, we don't mean there was an intentional greenwashing. What we found is rather that there was a lack of transparency on how the EU achieved these 2020 targets. So to make an example, so the lack of transparency is in many sense. First, the issue that I mentioned that by just reporting on what has been achieved, but without investigating the reasons behind, basically the Commission did not reveal the drivers behind the progress. So just stated, okay, we achieved the target, but there was no quantitative analysis on the extent to which this progress was due to genuine efforts, so policy action put in place by the member states, and to what extent it was due to external factors like the financial crisis in 2009 or the COVID pandemic in 2020. So what we recommend is to better distinguish between the impact of the policy put in place from the impact of external factors. So this is one issue of transparency, and another issue is related to the story of the flexibility, So the fact that member states can buy emissions allocation from other countries. So what we want to convey as message that this flexibility can make sense, but at the same time, we are talking about public money because member states are using public money from their own budget to buy these emissions. So to provide transparency to citizens, governments should be able to report to citizens how much they paid to buy these data, these renewable energy shares or these emissions from other countries. So at least citizens could be in a position to assess whether this flexibility is achieved their intended goals of improving the overall cost effectiveness of achieving the target. And finally, the other type of transparency that can be increased is the cost for the EU funding, national funding, and private sources for reaching the target. So it's important at the end of the day to say who has to pay for the transition and where do we get the money from, as simple as that. So to have an informed debate about the cost of the transition.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Lorenzo. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time right now to engage in a real discussion, but we'll have to move sadly because we're running a little bit late. But I just wanted to thank you both for your time, for joining us today. And we're gonna start the next and second panel with our colleagues from CNTF and Ember. Wonderful. We'll be presenting our analysis, but also Ember's work on the NECPs. We're also going to look into concrete opportunities and how to improve the NECPs before the deadline. We have the context that the Commission and the European Court of Auditors has presented us, and now let's see what still can be done. Super. So just joining us today here, we have Chris Rosloff, who's a senior analyst and the global energy, a senior analyst at the global energy think tank Amber. Chris looks at the progress being made in cleaning up Europe's power sector specifically, and how to accelerate the rollout of wind and solar, and as well as the enabling technologies that would unlock the entire clean power system. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. You have the floor.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for the introduction. As was mentioned, my plan today is to zoom in a bit to the power sector transformation and the story that the NECPs are telling us about this really important sector. The reason that we focus on this sector is because it's the first sector that needs to decarbonize, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And our work on this, our work on NECPs is really driven by a painstaking extraction of data from draft NECPs, which I'm sure fellow analysts on the call will sympathize with. It's been quite difficult to kind of get all the data from these very dense and technical documents, which are often not complete. So I hope this is insightful for you. I also want to thank the Commission before we start for their brilliant analysis that we've seen already. And hopefully my presentation here kind of complements that analysis that we've seen around the progress towards 2030 by kind of zooming in a bit further on some key aspects in the power sector. Next slide, please. So just for those of you who aren't aware of Ember, we're a global energy think tank, and our mission really is to accelerate the clean energy transition across the world, primarily using data-driven insights to influence policy. Next slide, please. I have three key messages for you today based on our analysis of NECPs. First of all, on wind and solar as kind of really key technologies. We've seen ambition really soaring in these two technologies compared to the last round of NECPs 5 years ago. But we do find that more ambition is needed to close that gap that Paolo already highlighted for us. The second message is around flexibility in the power system. The NECPs so far generally use supportive language and positive words around flexibility, technologies like storage, demand-side flexibility, but we still see few details and concrete measures, which is a clear opportunity to improve. And finally, I want to talk about data transparency and just touch on the importance of these NECPs delivering high-quality data, and a bit of our work so far to kind of map the key data gaps that are currently in these documents. Next slide, please. So to start with wind and solar, I think it's quite clear why we're so interested in these technologies in particular. You know, they hold the greatest potential to decarbonize not just the power sector, but the energy sector in the next decade as the most cost-effective technologies. And the REPowerEU plan from last year, or the year before rather, really recognized these technologies as key technologies and set some quite ambitious targets for their deployment by 2030. So an obvious task for us was to look at NECPs and see how well these deployment outlooks are comparing against those targets. And we find that ambition has radically increased in recent years. Wind ambition is up by 45% and solar by 70% for 2030. But there's still a meaningful gap between those numbers and REPowerEU targets. So member states need to look again really and see if they're really maximizing the use of these technologies in the power sector to displace fossil fuels and to achieve those energy targets, those common targets by 2030. Just on the numbers, 500 gigawatts of wind are needed by 2030, and nearly 750 gigawatts of solar. And we're just short of that really at kind of around 450 for wind and 650 for solar. So it's kind of very much a case of almost, but not quite there. Next, please. And when we look at the expected fuel mix in the power sector in 2030, it's a similar story. A similar story in the sense that ambition has rocketed in recent years. The EU is on course to have approximately 2/3 of its electricity coming from renewables by 2030, up from around 45% today. But it's still not quite enough. You know, the Repower EU plan saw above 70% of electricity coming from renewables by 2030. But what we do see from this picture here is that some member states are planning very high penetrations of renewables by 2030, with 5 member states planning to operate with 90% or more renewables in the power mix. And if we extend that to all clean technologies, then the number increases to 10 member states. So it's very clear that a fundamental technological shift is underway in the power sector. It's really unstoppable at this point. It's already happening. But we do see potential for member states to kind of go a bit further in this sector, particularly considering how the Commission's analysis points out quite nicely that when it comes to renewables overall, there is still a significant gap, and many member states are not fully delivering on their contribution towards the new renewables target for 2030. And we would argue that wind and solar in the power sector can be pushed just that bit further to close that gap and deliver the renewable supply that we need by 2030. And many analyses confirm that that additional effort would quickly pay back in terms of cheaper electricity and lower dependence on fossil fuels. Next, please. So kind of moving away from the ambition side of things and thinking a bit more about implementation and delivery, we've seen that there's a really rapid shift to renewables happening in the power sector. But that's ambition, that's on paper, that's all well and good, but it really won't happen if the power system does not become significantly more flexible to integrate those renewables. For example, the European Association for Energy Storage have estimated that 200 gigawatts of storage will be required in the EU by 2030. But when we look at NECPs, and this is a nice map by the Energy Storage Coalition on the right-hand side, many member states are still describing a continued role for fossil-based flexibility rather than clean alternatives, rather than battery storage, rather than demand-side flexibility. It's a continued role for gas to support renewables in the power sector, which is obviously not a future-proof solution. And we'd like to see more emphasis on future-proof storage technologies, short-term and long-term storage. And concrete measures are often lacking in draft NECPs so far. So I mentioned earlier, there's widespread supportive language and the recognition of the important role for storage and flexibility, but we're still missing those concrete measures. So our recommendation to member states would be where strategies exist for flexibility in the power system, then provide all the details in NECPs, and where the strategies don't exist, then we'd like to see commitments to producing those strategies as soon as possible. The electricity market design reform will require member states to produce flexibility plans by 2026, but we would argue that there simply isn't time to wait 2 more years to have these plans. We need to have them now, considering the speed of change underway in the power sector. Next, please. This is my final point on data transparency in the documents. So frankly, I think the European Commission, Paolo, you and your team worked miracles to produce your analysis, because we find that the key energy data in NECPs is full of holes and gaps. You mentioned that some countries don't yet provide that more ambitious scenario that we need to see. So this is the map across some kind of key data metrics, emissions, demand. power sector mix, so on and so on. And you can see there are hardly any member states that provide the full set of data. Data is really critical in these documents to provide that investment signal to industry, to enable participation of civil society, to involve infrastructure planning, et cetera, et cetera. So our recommendation would be to vastly improve provision and data quality, and towards the Commission to use all available levers to really ensure that high quality of data coming through in these key planning documents. Thanks for your attention. That's all I wanted to say. I'll just point out that there's more information on our website, including a live data tool that tracks some of these key metrics in NECPs. So please do visit there for further information. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. And indeed, I'll encourage the audience to check out the NSP tracker from Ember, which is incredibly interesting. Thank you also for this very data-driven sort of insights. I think it complements very well with what the first panel already showed us. Fantastic, Chris. I'll get back to you in a second for the Q&A. But first, we will quickly introduce you to our CATF experts in the second panel. We have Nicole Pavia, who's the program manager working the clean energy infrastructure deployment, and Edvard Pernod, my colleagues. Edvard, he's the carbon capture and storage policy manager, and he will be presenting a deep dive on CCS, which you will see in a minute. Both of them have been key in really developing CATF's work and our recommendations, as well as the playbooks that they will be presenting in a minute. Thank you so much to both of you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, and thank you, Chris, for your great presentation as well. My name is Nicole Pavia, and I am the program manager for our infrastructure deployment program here at CATF. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about CATF's additions to the NECP analysis and debate. So far, our involvement in the NECP process has been threefold. In September, we released a report called Bridging the Planning Gap, which I'll dig into a little bit more on the next slide. We're currently in the second phase of our assessment, where we are assessing the draft NECPs as they are submitted by the member states. I'll echo Chris's sentiments that the Commission has done amazing work going through all of this already, and it is a very data-intensive exercise. So I just want to thank everyone on our team who was involved in that effort. And concurrent to phases 1 and 2, we are developing recommendations to offer at both the EU and member state levels as the NECP drafting and finalization process unfolds. So now I'll just go through each of those efforts in a little bit more detail. Digging deeper into our Bridging the Planning Gap report, we focus on the value of the NECPs as interim planning mechanisms that member states can leverage to help the continent on the whole achieve its near, medium, and long-term climate goals. We all know that reaching net zero in 2050 is not something that will just inevitably happen. Member states will have to help provide investor certainty. They'll have to fund and research promising energy technologies that might need many years to get up to deployment level. They'll need to set up a clean energy workforce, and they'll also need to consider how to adapt to unforeseen events that will inevitably pop up along the way. And this is not an easy task, but the NECPs are a helpful tool that are already available to policymakers that can help. So our report recommends that all member state NECPs could benefit from a few key themes. The first is that NECP should reflect the deployment of a broad range of decarbonization options that would work best within each member state's particular national circumstances. We also recommend directing early stage funding to promising technologies that are in the earliest stages of development and in the research and development phase. NECP should also be as clear as possible about where investor support is needed, whether that be in that R&D stage or all the way through a technology that's ready to be deployed. Where does that money need to go? We also support cross-border solutions, as well as cross-border infrastructure planning. And of course, incorporating public consultations, opportunities for readjustment, and other kind of check-in moments that will keep decarbonization strategies current and relevant as time goes on. The second phase of our work dives deeper into member state-specific contexts, as well as our technology areas of interest. So in this phase, we are working to identify specific opportunities for member states to strengthen their NECPs before the submissions are due in June. And so far, we have assessed the draft NECPs across several programs of interest, which you can see here. We have listed a number of technology areas that we're interested in. In this exercise, we've noted if and where member states have included these technologies already in their NECPs, and if they have provided more specific metrics around implementation, funding, and development. And we've also noted if and where administrative streamlining and public consultation efforts have shown up in NECPs to date. And just to reiterate, this work all supports and reflects the excellent work that the Commission has already done to review all of the draft NECPs as they've been coming in. So what are some of our key findings from this assessment so far? I think overall, our findings reflect everything that was said by all of the panelists, that the targets laid out in NECPs are, of course, really ambitious. They're moving Europe in the right direction, but they're also not sufficient to achieve 2030 targets. And maybe most importantly, they're not setting up member states for success for 2050 in the current form. You can see here, this graph shows the percentage points by which member states projected greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, as they state in their own NECPs, are above or below their required share of emissions reductions, where the negative numbers show that countries are falling short in that regard. So as you can see, some more than others, but most countries are falling short of their emissions reductions that they pledged to in their NECPs. Another really big finding is that the NECP process is not yet fully integrated into broader planning and decarbonization processes in member states. So sometimes we found that there might even be other laws or agreements or policies in place within the member state, but those targets and policies are not necessarily integrated into NECPs and vice versa. And additionally, I think this reflects something Chris just said, but the NECPs tend to lack some specifics in terms of numbers and targets, and the plans to reach those numbers and targets are often vague. To pragmatically support member states in the NECP revision process and share the findings of our NECP analysis so far, CATF has developed a series of playbooks for member states with concrete recommendations specific to 5 technology areas that we focus on here at CATF: methane mitigation, carbon capture and storage, small modular reactors, super hot rock geothermal energy, and clean hydrogen. And these playbooks were informed by our analysis of the NECPs, but also our understanding of where details, policy and financing structures, and implementation plans are generally lacking. Supporting the spirit of optionality, going back to Lee's keynote, if a member state is interested in deploying a particular technology to support their overall decarbonization portfolio, we encourage them to look to our playbooks to get a better understanding of the technology itself, why acting quickly to fund, develop, or deploy this technology is important, and also they can find some concrete recommendations that can be adjusted to their national contexts. And we're really excited to have published these playbooks today. You can find the links to the playbooks in the chat. So just to show you a little preview of the information that you can find in our playbooks, on the right, this slide reflects the findings of the Super Hot Rock Energy Playbook. So on the right side of the screen, you'll see a map showing a kind of visualization of our technology-specific NECP analyses. So for the Super Hot Rock example, you'll see the map on the right represents countries which plan to include geothermal in their future energy mixes and which ones currently do not plan to do that. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see some concrete recommendations that member states can leverage while continuing to draft and finalize their NECPs. So in the case of Super Hot Rock Energy, for example, working together with other member states or institutions to pilot super hot rock energy systems is one recommendation. Another is setting up super hot rock specific measures when discussing geothermal energy more broadly. So in the interest of time, I'll just flash up some of our other playbook previews here. We don't have time, unfortunately, to go into detail into all of them. But please, I encourage you to interact with them on the website and contact us if you have any questions about any of the content. So this one here is our methane mitigation slide. I'll just show it for a second or two. This one here is our clean hydrogen slide. And this one here is our small modular reactors slide. I also mentioned that we do have a playbook on carbon capture and storage, but we wanted to make sure that we dedicated some time to digging into our work around carbon capture and storage, why we developed a playbook for this particular technology, and how carbon capture is currently or could fit into NECPs. So with that, I wanted to introduce my colleague, Edvard Pernot. He's the policy manager for carbon capture and storage and at CATF. And he'll now provide us a deeper dive into CCS. So thank you all so much for your attention.
Thanks, Nicole. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Edvard. I represent CATF working on our policy work on carbon capture and storage. And as we mentioned, one of our key areas is obviously in the National Energy Climate Plans, is sort of looking at things from a long-term perspective. And I think it's quite important to recognize as well that how quickly things have moved along on carbon capture policy over the last 2 years. I mean, even this week, for example, we've seen Germany has sort of announced its carbon management strategy. Basically 2 years ago, there was no real action whatsoever coming from the government. And I suppose now we're seeing it in Europe as well at the EU level with the industrial carbon management strategy, which was presented earlier this month, as well as the finalization of the Net Zero Industry Act. And so quickly as the discourse moved from sort of whether we need carbon capture and storage to how quickly can we scale it up and how quickly can we get a CO2 network developed. So if you go to our next slide, I think yeah. So as Nicole mentioned, this is sort of how we're working as well on the carbon capture team with regard to sort of our ongoing reports and analysis, some of which I'm also going to share with you today in the context of why carbon capture and storage is important for the National Energy and Climate Plans, as well as the assessments of those. We've taken a look at how member states have submitted their drafts, and then also working with member states, even on an individual basis, providing them sort of tailor-made recommendations. So for anyone in the audience who might be interested in CATF, giving some input into these draft NECPs, please feel free to reach out. And I'm sure our colleagues will also be more than welcome to provide some guidance as well on the other technology and impact areas that CATF works on. And so if you go to the next slide, please. So this is just an overview which we track currently. Some of you might have seen it before. It's just our project map where we tracked over 100 projects in development across Europe. As you'll see, most of those are in the industrial sector. That's where we see sort of most of the activity and the desire for deploying carbon capture and storage in Europe, as well as sort of some of the storage sites. And I'll get on to a sec, just looking at sort of storage in particular. So currently we have a target that's been set in the Net Zero Industry Act of getting to 50 million tons of storage capacity in the EU by 2030. The current operational capacity is basically nothing. So this is quite a quick acceleration that we desperately need, as well as reaching the 250 million ton target in the European Economic Area, and that's been set in the EU Industrial Carbon Management Strategy. So there's a lot of ambition there, and I think that it's good to see, as well as sort of the private sector has clearly shown its ambitions to scaling up these projects. And I think that bears in mind as sort of when policymakers now in other member states, and particularly looking at outside of the North Sea region, as to sort of member states that really need to try and get going when it comes to carbon capture policy. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is a separate tracker that CATF has recently developed, looking in particular at storage capacity, and sort of as you can kind of pretty clearly see, most of the current projects that have been developed in Europe are very much in the North Sea. I mean, this makes sense. You've got quite an existing oil and gas sort of infrastructure network that's been there, and the geology is quite well characterized. It's quite well understood. Less so in other EU member states. I would say though that at least from our reporting, particularly last summer, which we looked at storage capacity development in Europe, that all but 3 European countries have some capacity or potential to store CO2 geologically. And what's really needed is for member states to look at that and not just for climate reasons, but also for economic reasons. And I'll explain in a second as well as to sort of how this plays out when we're looking at it from a cost perspective. But I'll give an example. I think is of one country that really has very quickly looked at and recognized that it needs to develop its own domestic storage industry, and that's Germany. Europe's largest emitter. It's very quickly come into the game when looking at carbon capture and storage. And not only this week, the government has announced that it's intending to develop its own offshore storage sites in the European Economic Zone sort of area in the German offshore. I think that's quite important as well. Particularly as it's got, obviously a lot of emissions of its own. And previously the plans have been sort of purely to look at exporting CO2. But obviously now looking at the data and looking at how things add up when it comes to costs, the German government has decided that it needs to also try and develop storage of its own. So when we're looking at this tracker, obviously, like I said, most of the projects are being developed in the North Sea. But also what's quite worrying then as a sort of flip side to that is that only 10% of the planned capacity that's there right now in development is actually in Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe, and this is quite worrying. We have quite a lot of cement producers, of other sort of industrial producers in those regions. And the reality is, with the emissions trading system, with the targets that we need to reach net zero, well before 2050, particularly in those sectors, they're going to have to find means to capture and transport and store those emissions. And so if the storage isn't available domestically, that will mean they'll have to transport it somewhere else. And if we go to the next slide, please. So, as I said, this means that if the CO2 has to be transported over quite long distances, that means that the costs are going to be much, much higher. And so this tracker that we also have as a cost tool, it gives sort of a rough estimate of every point source in Europe and sort of how much it would cost to capture, transport, and store those emissions. And as you can pretty clearly see from the heat map that's on the tracker, you can see that, for stored sites that are close by to emitters, particularly looking at the Netherlands, for example, or the UK, the cost of carbon capture and storage is much, much lower than in other parts of Europe, particularly looking at sort of inland regions in Central Eastern Europe, or in Spain, for example, where there's not really any storage sites planned in most parts of the country. Obviously, when we're looking at constructing pipelines, when we're looking at harnessing the geological potential that we have in most parts of Europe, the costs come down. And if we go to the next slide, please. And if the costs come down, you can also see sort of how this plays out when looking at sort of where the CO2 sources are and where the storage is. So if we look at the left side of this graphic, you can kind of see how things are playing out currently. So those black lines are essentially sort of where the point sources are estimated and how they sort of get to either export terminals or to storage sites. And this sort of scenario is based on what we call a source and sink matching. And this is based essentially looking at what storage sites are currently in development. On the right side, you can see obviously much shorter arrows or lines. There's less CO2 that's traveling over long distances. It's much closer industry. We also have some onshore storage projects as well. And sort of the key takeaway from this is that that right side of the graphic, that scenario that's sort of based on developing storage sites in most EU member states, or certainly more than we have currently, is about 3 times cheaper when looking at the sort of the overall capital and operational expenditure that's required for this. So it's pretty clear that carbon capture and storage, at least when we know, looking at reports and evidence from all sorts of sources, particularly the International Energy Agency has done quite a lot of work. The carbon capture and storage isn't an expensive technology, but if it's not, if the industry, if the sector and the networks are not well designed, it can be much more expensive than it needs to be. And I think that's really important as well, looking for policymakers in the future. We're talking about reaching up to 250 million tons of storage capacity every year, and then also looking at sort of a net negative emissions economy as well in Europe, in future decades. It's important that the policymakers pay attention and try to get things right from the outset. And the national energy climate plans are a really good chance to begin that process, certainly for a lot of EU member states that haven't really begun so. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is some of the guidance that EU members or that EU member states were given by the Commission, looking at, for example, estimating, let's say, what sort of process emissions would be, being, available in the country. If you're looking at cement production, for example, about 2/3 of the emissions in cement plants are from the process itself. So they can't necessarily be avoided through the use of renewable energy or other sort of clean energy sources, as well as looking, at biogenic or direct air capture projects that could be available. I suppose what's most important really is looking at the geological storage capacity. Like I said, some EU member states have done a lot of work on this already. Others have a lot of work to do. And thankfully, some member states have actually taken the initiative themselves. France, for example, has a research project underway looking at trying to get better estimates of what its own CO2 storage capacity might be. And like I said, Germany is also, looking at it now, again, particularly at the offshore storage capacity. And so I think that's what's important is also to recognize that, the sooner that member states and policymakers begin to recognize that they need to develop a storage industry of its own, it might take upwards of a decade before the first commercial storage sites actually come online. And I think that, that's important to recognize, as well as that, you will also need to look at how CO2 can be exported, looking at cooperation between other member states, as well as the funding support. And I think, Mary's already drafted, an example of a carbon contracts for different scheme that different EU member states are looking at doing right now. My colleague Toby's developed this brief, which sort of looks at similar schemes that have been developed in the UK, in Denmark, as well as the Netherlands. And we're also looking at trying to do further analysis in terms of how similar schemes are being developed in France and Germany. And I think that that's also important, looking for member states who see sort of how can we deploy and incentivize carbon capture and storage, but in the most cost-effective way. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is an example of a roadmap for how we think, member states could look at employing carbon capture and storage in their own NECPs. Obviously, it's quite difficult for some. They have, a lot of ministries have not had experience with carbon capture and storage, or maybe haven't had experience for over a decade. But really, it's about looking at sort of where the projects are currently. Our map is a pretty good place to start. It's certainly the most comprehensive one out there, and it's updated quite regularly with all of the sort of commercial scale projects that are in planning, as well as looking at the potential to store CO2. Obviously, some member states are further along than others, but it's pretty clear from most estimates that are out there that the vast majority of EU member states have some potential at least. And then it's about sort of looking at, with your own geological survey, how can we actually try and get better, more accurate estimates. One thing that's also pretty useful, and it has worked quite successfully in some member states, is setting up clean transition dialogues. Germany, for example, in developing its carbon management strategy, had a stakeholder dialogue which involved groups, including CATF, but also lots of industry groups, other environmental NGOs, trade unions, academics, for example. And then, setting objectives and targets. I think it's quite clear that, we will need carbon capture and storage. But for industrial companies and for investors alike, it's also quite important to see clarity in terms of what the commitment is from EU member states as they want to deploy carbon capture and storage, and in particularly looking at negative emissions as well in the future. Having some details around the public and private financing plans, what is actually needed to get this industry going, how much is it going to cost, and if there is going to be public financing available, where is that funding going to come from, and in what form. And I think also what's important is looking at regional cooperation. There are some EU member states who don't have potential to store CO2, Finland and Estonia being some, for example, but they might also have industrial emitters, and will need to try and decarbonize those industries, or else they're going to have to shut down. And as well, for other member states, it might take upwards of a decade to develop their own storage industry. And so in the meantime, it's important to make sure that that maybe there's a capture project available, there's a transport network that's being developed. Maybe we can look at trade between member states, and it might make more sense to look at it that way, as well as also learning from experiences. We have a lot of EU member states now that have taken the initiative, that have been the forerunners, looking at Denmark and the Netherlands, for example. And those ministries have quite a lot of experience in dealing with carbon capture and storage. And it's pretty obvious from their national energy climate plans that they've outlined a lot of the work that's going on. Other EU member states could learn a lot from those member states, in particular, how they've actually gone about dealing with this topic. So that's all for me. Thank you very much for this presentation. And I would also be more than happy to extend a conversation with you to discuss further on carbon capture in the NECPs.
Thank you so much, Edward, for this very comprehensive presentation. And I'd like to quickly apologize for our audience because we'll be running just 3 more minutes late and they'll be closing. Edward, there is a lot of interest from our audience on CCS. Maybe if you could reply quickly on how the new industrial carbon management strategy can help member states really accelerate CCS. And lastly, personal question, the whole CCS value chain is incredibly complex, and we know that some member states haven't already started planning for this. What would be your recommendation, simply put? Thank you.
Sure. So, I mean, firstly, we very much welcome the initiative that the Commission has taken in developing the industrial carbon management strategy. It's only 2 years ago since really the Commission felt that it wasn't needed, and thankfully they decided to change their mind on that. And it's great as well, I think, that the targets that have been set in the industrial carbon management strategy, and obviously a lot of initiatives are going to be done at the EU level now at the next Commission. I think for EU member states individually, it's quite important to look at the storage investment atlas that has also been called for in the strategy. Like I said, focusing on storage is a key enabler to looking at this sector, particularly from the beginning, as well as the aggregation platform, which essentially, would enable private companies just to come and say, look, we would like to capture, this amount of emissions from this year. A transport company to say, look, we're planning to develop a pipeline network in this country capable of transporting this much. The same for storage providers as well. The more transparency that's available, also looking at costs as well, then we'll see things, developing in terms of competition. And so there's a lot of initiatives in there as well. I think also for some EU member states, they just quite frankly haven't really begun to think about this. So I think having an EU strategy that's there, having the fora that's available, for example, through the CCUS forum that's now occurring annually, as well as sort of regular meetings that are ongoing. I think there's a lot of opportunities that the Commission has offered for member states to really get going on carbon capture and storage, and particularly focusing on the storage part, I think, because that's the one that is the enabler to the entire value chain, and also takes quite probably the most amount of time in terms of to get up and running.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this comprehensive answer. If anyone in the audience has additional questions, please feel free to reach out. We'll happily try to reply very soon. Wonderful. So just to close up this webinar, we started really asking our question here if Europe is on track to meet the 2030 targets. I think by now we know that, well, they've taken a lot of steps, countries in the right direction. There's a significant gap that still exists. We've seen this from different perspectives and institutions. We've also seen the importance of planning and not underestimating planning ahead. And I think the last important key message is that we have now very important legal frameworks in place, and it is fundamental to get the NECPs right, even in the 4 months that we have ahead before we chart a course towards the policy implementation. Before I finish, I just wanted to thank our panelists for their participation and contributions. I'd also like to invite the audience to give our feedback and further explore our online materials and recently launched playbooks. We will also be sending out the recording of the webinar very soon. So thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great week ahead. Goodbye.